There's more trouble on the horizon for President Biden. Half of his supporters said they would be open to another candidate in 2024. This is according to a Quinnipiac University poll published on Wednesday. While 51% of respondents are willing to switch their vote to a different candidate, 46% reported they plan on sticking with Biden.
Meanwhile, Washington Post columnist David Ignatius penned an op-ed calling for Biden to bow out of the 2024 presidential election. In the piece titled "President Biden Should Not Run Again in 2024, Ignatius writes, quote, "It's painful to say that given my admiration for much of what they have accomplished, but if he and Harris campaign together in 2024, I think Biden risks undoing his greatest achievement, which was stopping Trump." Here to help us break this all down is Sabrina Salvati, host of the Sabs podcast. Welcome, Sabrina. I'm wondering, given that the Washington Post has this column now just openly discussing and calling for Joe Biden not to run again, is this a one-off? Is this the establishment getting the marching orders that it's time to sort of jettison Joe Biden? What exactly do you make of this?
I think so. I think this is a good example of how mainstream media participates in electoral politics and can push and sway some of these political decisions. So if the Washington Post, which is a big one, is speaking out and they're vehemently against Joe Biden running for re-election, I think that definitely sends off bells and whistles in reference to the Democratic Party and the DNC as well. I think what people are going to start thinking about, there have been rumblings about no labels as well. There have been rumblings about possibility of a Joe Manchin running against Joe Biden. He hasn't confirmed that yet, but there have been talks about that. But we also have to remember there's also Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. Running against Joe Biden inside the Democratic Party. And Cornel West is running against Joe Biden through the Green Party. There's also Dr. Shiva running as an independent. Jasmine Sullivan's running as an independent. Those are just some of the few that I know off the top of my head. And I think that this could really open up a lane for a third party run, for someone to come in outside of the duopoly, for those voters, those half of those voters who said they want someone other than Joe Biden. Maybe they may start to look towards a third party option. And I think that that would be great for someone like a Cornel West. A lot of people that I've spoken to, they didn't even know that Joe Biden had primary challengers. I know a lot of us in this space, sometimes we can find that hard to believe because this is what we talk about a lot, talk about politics, so we're heavily paying attention. But a lot of people don't even know that Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr. are actually running against Joe Biden. Either they're not paying attention to electoral politics yet, or they just haven't seen this information. So I really do think this could be the year going into 2024. This could be the time where a third party race could really break out.
I think that's a really good point about the lane for a third party candidate that exists right now. I remember the narrative was largely that people voted for Biden because Trump was a loose cannon. He didn't do a good job with COVID. We don't know what he's going to do with the nuclear codes. Why is he talking to Kim Jong-un? And so I think that all of this is totally flipped on its head with this recent poll from Quinnipiac, which found that Americans overwhelmingly trust Trump to handle a national crisis better than Biden. 52% think Trump would do better, while 42% believe Biden would. I think this has a lot to do with how he handled, the crisis economically in our country immediately when he came into office. There were a lot of policies around economic stimulus that were necessary, but not a lot of policies that lifted up the working class in America that were struggling the most during the pandemic. What do you credit this flip to, Sabrina, or do you think it's a flip at all compared to how people were voting in 2020?
I think the economy is a huge factor. A lot of people are not happy with the inflation rates, which as many times as I've heard politicians say that the economy is actually improving. I just saw something recently the other day that said the inflation rate has actually increased again. So there's that. The grocery store prices are increasing at least every week where I live. So I think the economy is a big factor for people. And some people are going to vote with their wallets when they vote in 2024. The other issue is in reference to handling a national crisis. I think that also goes back to Joe Biden's cognitive ability. I think a lot of people see Joe Biden is making up stories. He's saying he was present the day after 9/11 in New York when he was in D.C. He's continuing to fall down. He's stumbling over his words during press conferences. He's asking where he's supposed to go next. It's very apparent that Joe Biden is struggling mentally. He's having those issues. So, in reference to handling some type of catastrophe or disaster, I understand why more Americans would say that they don't feel comfortable with Biden handling that because he just doesn't seem to have it all together at this point.
It is interesting to see the difference between the Biden supporters and the Trump supporters. And if you look at the numbers, former President Trump supporters have proved more loyal to their preferred candidate than Biden's did, which I think goes to a lot of what you were just explaining. So among voters who said they plan on supporting Trump in the Republican primary, 68% said they are firmly set on the former president, regardless of what happens between now and the Republican primary. Now, 29% said they might change their candidate choice depending on what happens. But then over on Biden's side, he leads Trump by 1 percentage point, 47 to 46, in a survey of the general electorate in the Quinnipiac poll. So what does this say about Joe Biden and his supporters? You know, again, you mentioned that a lot of people did look to him in 2020 in order to sort of stop Trump. But then you look at people now saying, well, you know, Trump might actually do a better job of handling a crisis. What does it say about Joe Biden's job performance that his people just are not as willing to stick with him?
This is the danger about not having a solid base. Joe Biden didn't establish a solid base. A lot of the people that voted for him again were voting against Donald Trump, or they were the standard, I'm going to vote for the Democratic Party because I'm a Democrat type of voter, right? Who is polled in these polls? I don't know about either of you, but I've never been polled. Most of my friends have never been polled. It seems like they're polling mainly people that tend to be older and those that have landlines. So there's a lot of us that are left out, and I'm curious to see what that number would be if they included more like Gen Z or millennial voters as well. It'd probably be less than 68% willing to support Joe Biden. But I think what this shows is that regardless how many times politicians continue to say that Joe Biden has done a lot of things and he's done a great job, it's obvious that when the American people look at their bank accounts and when they look at their material conditions, those needs have not been met. People are still struggling. We still have to deal with inflation. A lot of these are economic concerns. There's also Joe Biden, choosing not to follow up on his student debt promises to people, choosing not to forgive student debt for students that went to HBCUs. That still hasn't happened. That whole student debt cancellation issue, the way that he chose to do it versus the way that he was told to do it by his own colleagues there in DC, it's been a complete disaster. So I think economically, people are going to show that type of vote. Now, there's always going to be that fear that, well, we don't want to get someone like Donald Trump again. But I feel that the Democratic Party is going to use that excuse regardless of who the candidate is so that they can win. If the Democrats lose in 2024, maybe this will be a wake up call for the party in reference to trying to shut out the concerns of the American people, particularly these economic concerns for people who are working class and people who are poor in this country, instead of and trying to toe that establishment line. Maybe it'll be a wake up call, maybe not.
When I think about this third party lane, we've had a lot of conversations in the United States recently about what this means for the party duopoly. Can we change it? And my thinking is yes, of course we can. And there's no better time to do it than now. When we see that voter turnout is about 60% for presidential elections at most in the United States, it really shows that there's a 40% of the country that is still gettable, and neither major political party, the Republicans nor the Democrats, are getting them. So when people like Cornel West or whoever runs with a third party campaign is a spoiler candidate, it doesn't make sense to me because there's 40% of the American people that neither party is getting right now. If you want to win, maybe inspire more people to go out and vote. The American people are apathetic for a reason, and I think you accurately say it's for economic reasons. But do you think there's a candidate right now that can help that 40% that's not active show up to the polls so that we have a viable third party in the United States?
Yes, I think Cornel West would be your best bet. I really do. A lot of people love Cornel West. They know him from the activist scene. Some people know him from academia. Some people know him because of his experiences with Bernie Sanders campaigns. So I think that he's someone that's known across the United States for different reasons. And I will say, I think that someone like a Cornel West, if he's able to get the non-voters to come out, this could really disrupt this duopoly. Even if Cornel West does not win, it can still send a strong message. And I think that it's important to pay attention to those voters that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party don't care about. It's important to campaign to those people as well. You got to give them something to vote for. People don't come out and vote. For those that are non-voters, they don't come out and vote because there's nothing for them to vote for. They know that their material conditions are not going to change. They know that they're still living paycheck to paycheck, regardless if it's a Democrat or Republican that's in office. That's why those people don't show up to come out to vote. Now, in reference to the spoiler comment, they continue to say this about third party candidates. It's really interesting. Like, I would argue it's not even so much that they're saying that Cornel West is a spoiler to Joe Biden. What they're really saying is that Cornel West is a spoiler to the military industrial complex in corporate America. That's what the spoiler bell is about, because he's running against those things. He's running against the MIC. He's running against corporate greed and getting corporate money out of electoral politics. He's running against those two things which control both parties. That's what the spoiler effect is that they're talking about, not necessarily about Joe Biden. Considering the fact that half of Biden voters don't want to vote for Joe Biden at this point, I would argue Joe Biden is the spoiler candidate. Maybe that's how we should start phrasing this. Joe Biden, you need to step down. You're the spoiler.
I think that's definitely going to be a refrain that comes up more often, as I do think we're in a place uniquely where there is a lane for a third party to definitely mount a bid here. I do think it's interesting that we'll have to see what happens with that. There's more rising after this.